Good morning, and I'm pleased to be here during Native American Heritage Month. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to mention a couple of things. I brought a few copies of the July-August issue of Oklahoma Horses, which I edit, and I have an article in it on the transfer of Will Rogers' Birthplace Ranch from the ownership of the through the state to the Cherokee Nation, with some photographs from my family archives of the original house in its original location before it was moved. I also have a few copies on the back table if someone would like to pick these up when you go out, of Cooey Scooey Journal, which was published in the 1990s by Rogers State University. And I'd like to read what it says about Cooey Scooey. Cooey Scooey's name has its origins in Cherokee language and history. The word was known in ancient times as the onomatopoeia word for a large bird, gooey's gooey, said to have been seen at infrequent intervals in old Cherokee country, accompanying migratory wild geese, and described as resembling a large snipe with yellow legs and unwebbed feet. More recently, it was the Cherokee name for John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokees during the 19th century removal period and subsequent trail where they cried. Currently, Cooey Scooey is the name of the present Cherokee Nation district where Claremore and Rogers State University are located. So if you'd like to pick any of these up when you go out, you're welcome to take them with you. My presentation today is called Eagle Flight, The Remarkable Life and Career of Wahilla LaHaye, Cherokee Journalist, 1906-1992. And it's in honor of Patricia Wingate Lockwood, 1922-2005, who first told me about her Aunt Wah. I first heard about Wahilla LaHaye in 1988 from her niece, Patricia Wingate Lockwood, who told me tantalizing tidbits about Wahilla's early aviation adventures and her long career as a prominent journalist in Oklahoma City, Kansas City, Denver, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. The next year, Pat sent me clippings of articles by and about Wahilla and encouraged me to write a journal article about her because she deserved recognition for her many accomplishments. I told Pat it sounded interesting, but I was too involved in other projects to take on another one. Pat was an established Cherokee historian and genealogist, and I suggested that she write about Wahilla herself. But she replied, quote, "It would be difficult for a family member to write about Wahilla. Suffice it to say that the only soul who could live under the same roof with her for more than 48 hours without needing psychiatric help was my patient mother, Wahilla's sister Helen, who lived with Wah in New York for a number of years. We all admire Wah. We remember the bright, amusing things she has said and done, but we are too close to her presence to remain correctly detached. She has one son, her only child, who lives in Bixby. I remember Phil saying to me, I always make sure I'm sitting down before I read a letter from Mom. That is because Wah always manages to have a health crisis instead of just a head cold or a bruise. So we go off into peals of laughter when we really shouldn't. I am sure you know the way things go within families," end quote. So I kept the clippings about Wahilla and stowed the idea of writing about her in the far back recesses of my mind. Then a few years ago, I regained copies of almost all the correspondence Pat Lockwood and I had exchanged between 1988 and her death in 2005. Hundreds of letters, cards, clippings, and photocopies. Rereading Pat's letters, I found a wealth of material on Cherokee history and genealogy and many mentions of her Aunt Wahilla LaHaye. Suddenly, I thought maybe I could write something about Wahilla to honor her and Pat. Now, of course, I wish I had pursued the project much earlier while Wahilla, a sister, son, and family, and nieces and nephews were all still living and could have been interviewed and provided material and photographs. I will say up front that my research on Wahilla LaHaye is a work in progress. It is like pursuing a moving target because of her extensive and varied career, her many relocations, her purposely vague statements on personal matters, and her intricate connections with famous people as she became a celebrity herself. It is difficult to be sure of details on every place she worked and when she worked there. I am not positive I have found all her marriages and divorces. So this will be like a Reader's Digest condensation of facts about Wahila LaHaye as I understand them now. More searching will doubtless uncover more interesting tales. Photo 1 is a picture of Wahila LaHaye superimposed on a montage of some of the newspapers she worked for early in her career. She became a groundbreaking journalist who was on friendly terms with movie stars, presidents, first ladies, and many other prominent people. Perhaps that was because she came from a line of prominent people herself. Wahila LaHaye was a great-great-granddaughter of Judge John Martin, first treasurer of the Cherokee Nation and justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court. He was married to 2 Cherokee wives simultaneously, sisters Eleanor Nellie McDaniel and Lucy McDaniel, and raised several children with each one. His wife Eleanor was the great-great-grandmother of Wahila. Eleanor and John Martin's son Bryce Martin and his wife were Wahila's grandparents. Bryce Martin died en route to California during the gold rush. Bryce's daughter, Helen Mar Martin, married John D. LaHaye, whose family was from St. Genevieve, Missouri. John and Helen were the parents of Joseph Martin LaHaye, Wahila's father. John LaHaye died when his son Joseph was an infant. Like his great-grandfather, John Martin, Joseph Martin LaHaye grew up to be an exceptional leader in the Cherokee Nation. In a book published in Indian Territory in 1901, a biographical sketch describes Joseph Martin LaHaye as a foremost citizen of great force of character and exceptional ability with a capacity for leadership. LaHaye was born on August 27, 1865 at Boggy Depot, Choctaw Nation, where his family had gone as refugees during the Civil War. He felt very connected to the tribe through close family kinships with the Wadys and related families. As a young child, he lived for several years in the household of Stand Wady after the Civil War. Joseph Martin LaHaye attended school in the Cherokee Nation and later in Krebs, Choctaw Nation, while his mother and stepfather, John Phelps, lived there. LaHaye worked in coal mines and then became a bookkeeper and later cashier for Osage Coal Mining Company. He then worked for J.J. McAllister, founder of the town of McAllister in the Choctaw Nation. LaHaye also studied law so he could pursue a career in Cherokee government. In 1886, Joseph Martin LaHaye married Annie Cockburn Russell, who had been born in Coombesnethan, Lanark, Scotland in 1864. She was the daughter of James Russell and Margaret Cockburn Russell, who immigrated with their family from Scotland to McAllister. Joseph and Annie's first child, a son named John Phelps LaHaye, was born in McAllister in 1887. The LaHayes then moved to Claremore in 1888, where Margaret Russell LaHaye was born in 1890 and Helen Mar LaHaye in 1894. Photo 2, taken in probably the late 1890s, shows Annie Russell LaHaye and Joseph Martin LaHaye and their children John, Margaret in front, and Helen. After moving to Claremore, Joseph Martin LaHaye was twice elected clerk of Cooey-Scooey District and served 2 years in the Cherokee Senate, of which he was president. He was a tribal delegate to Washington, D.C., and treasurer of the Cherokee Nation, as his great-grandfather had been. LaHaye was the first mayor of Claremore and served 2 terms. He was a delegate at large to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1896. LaHaye was Presbyterian and was active in the Masons, Knights of Pythias, Independent Order of Oddfellows, and the Improved Order of Red Men. LaHaye advocated the formation of the state of Sequoia from the tribal lands in what is now eastern Oklahoma, but the proposal was tabled in the U.S. Congress in 1905. In 1907, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory entered the Union, merged as one state. By that time, Annie and Joseph LaHaye had welcomed one more child to the family, Elizabeth Wahila, who was born in Claremore on July 14, 1906. She seems never to have used her first name, Elizabeth, even on official records, but always went by Wahila. It is a Cherokee female given name and place name. Wahila LaHaye and other people, especially during her aviation days, made much of the supposition that the name Wahila meant eagle or little eagle in Cherokee. I do find a similarity to Wohali, a Cherokee word for eagle, but to the best of my understanding and study, nothing in the word Wahilla correlates with little. Muddled information persists about the year of Wahilla's birth, partly because she typically subtracted years off her age. When I asked her niece Pat Lockwood in 1989 how old her Aunt Wahilla was, she said, quote, "She has told so many fibs about her age that I would have to look in my files to find the answer. I once wrote to my Aunt Margaret and asked her to tell me the straight truth in the matter and swore I'd keep it to myself as long as Wah was living. So Aunt Margaret responded, and I filed the answer away. Now that Wah is owning up to being along in years, she probably doesn't care anymore. She wrote me a few months ago that she was suffering from arthritis, had to wear a cervical collar, etc. But next letter, she was planning another cruise. I never know what to think. My entire family is like that," end quote. Some later sources are still wrong about Wahilla LaHaye's age. For example, the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame lists Wahilla's birth year as 1909, and Findgrave inexplicably says 1896. Wahilla would have been horrified. Believe me, if she misrepresented her age, she certainly wouldn't have added 10 years to it. What woman would? But with digital sources available today, it was easy to establish that her birth year was, in fact, 1906. The LaHayes moved from Claremore to Muskogee in 1908 because it offered more opportunities for Joseph Martin LaHaye's successful legal practice. He had even taken cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. But LaHaye became ill in the fall of 1910 and went to New Mexico for a while, hoping for better health. He returned to Muskogee in the spring and died on May 29, 1911, at age 45 at the family home on Callahan Street. Thus, Wahilla, not yet 5 years old, lost the vital connection to the Cherokee side of her family with her father's death. Her siblings, being older, kept his memory alive. Wahilla grew up in Muskogee and started her newspaper career in her teens on the Muskogee Phoenix. She attended Muskogee Central High School, where she was active in the Press Association and the Gunakis, a group which studied the lives of great women. She sang first alto in the Girls' Glee Club and was social chairman of the YWCA, perhaps getting an early start on the social aspects of her later career. Photo 3 is a picture of Wahilla from the 1922 Muskogee Central High School yearbook. She graduated in 1923, several weeks before her 17th birthday. Wahilla then attended Oklahoma A&M, now OSU, in Stillwater for 2 years, where she worked on the school newspaper, the O Collegian, and was a member of Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. She then went to work for 2 affiliated newspapers, the Daily Oklahoman and the Oklahoma City Times, covering society news, to which most newspaper women at that time were assigned. One of her memorable moments was when she interviewed handsome Prince William of Sweden, who rather swept her off her feet. Wahilla's time was not totally taken up with her job. In 1927, she was chosen Miss Indian Princess at a contest in Pawhuska. But Wahilla probably longed for more substantial newspaper assignments as she matured as a writer and a person. She married Philip Merriman Lohman II, a native of Tennessee, on February 9, 1929. Both lived in Oklahoma City at the time, and both were 22 years old. It is possible that Wahilla kept the marriage secret, as many women did, so they would not lose their jobs. Some jobs were not available to married women of that era, who supposedly could rely on their husbands to support them. But that didn't suit Wahilla. She wanted it all, a career and marriage. In an age when most women never worked outside the home and many of them didn't learn to drive a car, she had been working in a skilled profession since she was a teenager and was about to soar into an adventurous field of endeavor that few women tried. At about the time she married, Wahilla talked the Oklahoma City Times into paying for her to take flying lessons in exchange for writing a long series of articles about learning to fly. Aviation was a hot topic at the time. In May 1927, Charles Lindbergh had made his solo transatlantic flight. On a tour to promote the burgeoning aviation industry, he flew to Oklahoma City, Bartlesville, Muskogee, and finally Tulsa, where he landed on September 30th, 1927. Tulsa Municipal Airport opened the next year. In Oklahoma City, Wahilla LaHaye took 11 hours of flying lessons at Graham Flight School in March and April 1929 and flew solo by early May at the latest. That feat sparked much publicity, and she became famous as the Oklahoma City Times Flying Girl. That name stuck with her throughout her life and even appeared in the headline of her obituary. Photo 4 shows the Sunday aviation page of the Tulsa Tribune on May 12, 1929, which contains a description of Wahilla's aviation achievements under the headline, "State Girl Will Pilot Plane in State Air Tour." This article says in part, quote, "On the records of the Graham School at Oklahoma City Municipal Airport, where Miss LaHaye learned to fly, the story of her conquest of the air is told in a few terse entries in the logbook kept by the operations officer. It is set down for permanent records that Miss LaHaye soloed after only 11 hours of instruction over a period of just 1 month, from March 10th to April 10th of this year. She is now accumulating the additional hours necessary before she will receive her limited commercial license from the Department of Commerce." Still quoting, "It remains for the attaches of the Graham School, however, to tell the real story of Miss LaHaye's achievements in her school course. To begin with, she soloed in record time, both as to hours in the air and on the basis of days under instruction. She was the first woman ever to be soloed by the Graham School, which has been in operation many years in Norman and Oklahoma City. Finally, she demonstrated on her first solo flight and several times since that she has the flying it, which is intestinal stamina coupled with air sense and a thorough understanding of aviation mechanics." End quote. Photo 5 is a clipping of an Associated Press article from the Ponca City News of June 11th, 1929. It is short but informative and typical of the type of coverage generated by Wahilla's flights. I will read it in its entirety. The headline is Little Eagle. Quote, "Little Eagle of the Cherokees has proved her wings. Wahilla LaHaye made her first solo flight after only 11 hours of instruction. Her instructors said she flew alone with less experience than any previous student, male or female, on an Oklahoma City field. Her name, pronounced Wahilla, is Cherokee for Little Eagle. She is a newspaper reporter in non-flying hours. She visited Ponca City recently on the state air tour." End quote. Despite the publicity at the time, the significance of Wahilla LaHaye's early flights seems to have been mostly overlooked by later historians. When I contacted Oklahoma Historical Society last summer for confirmation that Wahilla was the first woman to fly solo in Oklahoma, records there showed that Eula Pearl Carter Scott might have been the first on September 12, 1929. However, the newspaper articles from May and June proved that Wahilla LaHaye had already soloed before then, and thus was probably not just the first woman to fly solo in Oklahoma City, but the first in the state. Oklahoma Historical Society is now starting a research file on Wahilla and planning an online encyclopedia article. Only a little more than a year after Wahilla flew around the state on an air tour, she and her husband, Phil Lohman, started a new chapter in their lives as parents. They must have been visiting or working in Texas when their son, Philip Merriman Lohman III, was born there on July 29, 1930. Wahilla kept on with her career and eventually branched out into radio. She and Lohman evidently moved to Kansas City and then divorced because he married another woman there in early April 1935. Wahilla and Philip Lohman's son, Phil, was not yet 5 years old when his parents divorced, the same age Wahilla had been when her father died. Wahilla was living in Kansas City when the 1940 census was taken and apparently moved to Chicago in late 1940 or early 1941. Her first byline for the Chicago Sun was on December 8, 1941, the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. She worked as radio editor and amusement editor at the Sun. In late March 1943, Wahilla LaHaye, described as the Chicago Sun film critic, married John Jacques Wildberg at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Chicago. Wildberg, who had been born in 1902, was a New York copyright attorney who worked as a theatrical producer from 1938 to 1951. He co-produced the first revival of Porgy and Bess in 1942, a play called One Touch of Venus in 1943, and several other plays. He and Wauhilla must have spent part of their time in New York because of his work. One of Wildberg's previous marriages to novelist Ursula Parrott had ended when she divorced him on grounds of intolerable cruelty. Whatever the situation was with Wauhilla, their marriage was so brief that she is not even listed on current websites as his wife. Only 4 months after she and Wildberg married, Wauhilla was granted a divorce in Chicago on July 30th, 1943. By February 9th, 1944, she was working at a new job in New York. By about the late 1940s, Wauhilla was living in Greenwich Village and working at N.W. Ayer Advertising Agency in Radio City Music Hall, doing publicity for radio, television, and the press. Photo 6 shows an article written during that time by David Surek, a publicist and theatrical writer who had roots in Oklahoma City. His interview with Wauhilla tells how she was handling publicity for many celebrities who had become her friends, including Lily Pons, Helen Hayes, Dorothy Lamour, who's shown in the lower photograph there with Wauhilla, Yasha Heifetz, and Jimmy Durante. Durante was unable to pronounce Wauhilla's name and always called her Wanda Hayes. Surek also quotes newspaper columnist Robert Ruark, who said Wauhilla LaHaye was one of the best known women in the world. People he had met all over the world knew about her. Quote, on a banana boat in the Honduras, a restaurant in Portugal, a newspaper office in Mexico City, an airport in Finland, and in the railroad station at St. Joseph, Missouri, strangers who learned that he, Ruark, was a newspaper man, asked him if he knew Wauhilla LaHaye, end quote. Wauhilla enjoyed socializing with colorful, interesting people. During the 1940s or early 1950s, she introduced some of her family to her famous friends. Her niece, Patricia Wingate Lockwood, described a party at the home of Victor Hammer, brother of businessman and art collector Armand Hammer. Quote, I met Armand's younger brother, Victor, many years ago at his apartment in New York. My first husband, Howard Newmark, my Aunt Wauhilla, and I had dropped in for a soiree Russian style. Cushions on the floor, Victor playing a balalaika, his wife at the piano, etc. And I remember Victor as a charming, good-natured man. We didn't stay at the party very long. Wauhilla's current husband was a friend of the Hammers, but I do recall that Irene Wicker, Victor's wife, an actress, was wearing an emerald ring that was so exquisite, even its enormous size couldn't render it tacky. And it turned out to be one of the buttons from the Emperor Maximilian's dress uniform from the 1860s, end quote. Starting in the late 1940s, several people who were or had been close to Wauhilla died. Her brother, John Phelps LaHaye, died in Kansas in 1947 at age 60. Her first husband, Philip Lohman, died the next year. Nowata native William R. Moore, Wauhilla's first cousin on the Scottish side of the family, was about her age and started his newspaper career in Oklahoma City. He and Wauhilla were very close, and he visited her several times in New York. Moore was an Associated Press correspondent who went to Korea on the second day of the war. In July 1950, he was killed when he dropped his pencil and notebook to help wounded American troops in a tank platoon. He was listed as missing until 1955, when his remains were identified. In 1951, Wauhilla's mother, Annie Russell LaHaye, died and was buried in Muskogee. Wauhilla married Jack Long, an associate editor of American Magazine, on December 30th, 1953, in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He was touring the West Indies, writing a series of articles for the magazine. Long, whose family was from Westport, Connecticut, had graduated with honor from Harvard University and served in the U.S. Army in Europe during World War II. Apparently, Wauhilla's marriage to Jack Long, too, was brief, although research on divorce records is incomplete. In the meantime, Wauhilla's son, Phil Lohman, had grown up attending private schools in Chicago and New York, but he also spent time in Oklahoma and credited his mother and his aunt, Margaret LaHaye, for his upbringing. He graduated from Oklahoma Military Academy in Claremore and served in the U.S. Air Force in the Philippines during the Korean War before earning a degree at Northeastern State in Tahlequah. In his early career, he taught school in Muskogee. In 1959, he married Patricia Jo Wagner. Wauhilla moved to Washington, D.C. in 1963 when she started a job with Scripps Howard newspapers. Later, she was on the governing board of Scripps Howard Broadcasting. She wrote a column called Potomac Patter about social doings in Washington, and she lived in an apartment in Georgetown. She also, in 1965, one of her stories was on LaDonna Harris, the wife of Senator Fred Harris of Oklahoma. A very interesting story. Wauhilla covered the first ladies, Lady Bird Johnson, Pat Nixon, and Betty Ford. She traveled with them extensively, was a bridge partner of Lady Bird Johnson. There are huge collections of papers in the Johnson Presidential Library and the Nixon Presidential Library containing correspondence between the first ladies and Wauhilla. She attended many official White House functions and social events for ambassadors and ministers from all over the world. Photo 7, taken by well-known White House photographer Robert C. Knudsen, shows Wauhilla LaHaye dancing with Gregory Peck. The top half of President Lyndon Baines Johnson's face can be seen in the background. If you look there over Peck's shoulder. Photo 8, taken during a press conference, shows Wauhilla LaHaye interviewing President Richard M. Nixon. This photo was used in the 4.5-minute OCO-TV Cherokee Almanac segment on the life and times of Wauhilla LaHaye. Clearly, Wauhilla LaHaye had inherited her father, Joseph Martin LaHaye's capacity for leadership. As one example, First Lady Pat Nixon installed Wauhilla as the first female president of the Washington Press Club in 1973. Pat Nixon also invited Wauhilla to spend a night at the White House, but that was postponed because of President Nixon's resignation in August 1974. But Betty Ford knew about it and renewed the invitation for October 1974. However, she became sick suddenly and was in the hospital. So her sister-in-law served as her hostess, and Susan Ford, who was a teenager, helped to make Wauhilla welcome in the White House in October 1974. And they toured the White House at night in their robe and slippers to get a nighttime view of what it was like. And photo 9 shows the article Wauhilla wrote about her night at the White House for the Washington Star News on October 6, 1974, on the last workday of her career. She retired from Colorado Springs. Photo 10 is a picture of Wauhilla LaHaye as she looked when she was inducted into the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame in 1977. Photo 11 shows Wauhilla in her later years. She died in March 1992. There was no service was held. She was cremated and ashes were buried in Green Hill Cemetery in Muskogee with her parents, brother, and her sisters, Helen, who had died in 1962, and Margaret, who had died in 1988. But the story doesn't end there. Her son, Phil Lohman, died of lung cancer in October 1997 and was buried in Owasso. And when his obituary was published, I figured out that his wife, Pat Wagner Lohman, was a neighbor of my family in Mingo many years before and had been one of the childhood friends of my cousins who were raised by my parents. So that was an interesting little thing. And I also figured out I had met her when she was selling antiques in Bixby many years before, but I didn't know who she was or how she was connected with any of these other people. Mm-hmm. She was the informant for for Wauhilla's obituary. The information all came from her daughter-in-law, Pat Lohman. Meantime, my good friend Pat Lockwood died in 2005, and her 2 older sisters died later. So by the time I began to research Wauhilla in the early part of this year, I tried to find Pat Lohman and discovered she had died in 2014 and is buried with her husband and son and her parents and brother in Owasso. So I don't know what happened to Wauhilla's belongings. I have been unable to find out whether she left a repository of her papers and photographs and memorabilia from her career, which should have been placed, we hope, in some archive or museum. So I don't know what happened to any of that, and she has no living descendants. So the only family member available for me to interview was Todd LaHaye Newmark, son of Patricia Wingate Lockwood and grandnephew of Wauhilla LaHaye. I'm extremely grateful to Todd for combing his memories of LaHaye family stories and for sending me a copy of the photograph of Wahilla dancing with Gregory Peck. Kathy Huber, retired director of the Genealogy Center at Tulsa City County Library System, has done extensive and valuable research for this project, and I am so thankful for her help. Mary Downing of Muskogee, Mallory Covington of Oklahoma Historical Society, and Luke Williams of Tulsa Historical Society have also provided information. Thank you to David Hampton and Andy Squires for helping with my PowerPoint slides, to Bill Shotpouch for transportation, and to Beth Harrington for lodging in Tahlequah. And most of all, I am so glad that my dear friend, the late Patricia Wingate Lockwood, got me started on this path of discovery about the remarkable life and career of her Aunt Wah. Pat said this about Wahilla and other women of that generation who had successful careers, quote, "I never heard Wahilla say she was deprived of anything because she was a woman. How did such women make it without the help of the liberation movement? Not a peep or a whine out of them, to my knowledge. They just did it," end quote. Wahilla LaHaye's legacy lives on in the countless newspaper articles she wrote, many of which are now preserved in accessible digital files. Her stories show us several decades of American life, people, and politics as she saw them and lived them. And her legacy includes a spirited, pioneering young Cherokee aviator who soared in eagle flight. Her ancestors would have been proud of their flying girl. That's all.